They looked down on the farmer at the business event, without knowing he owned everything. Thomas Blackwell took a deep breath before pushing the heavy glass doors of the most luxurious hotel in New York City. His calloused hands trembled slightly, not from nervousness, but from a deep pain he had carried for years. The event happening in that gilded hall would forever change many lives, including his own. The 68-year-old man, with his well-groomed white beard and worn leather hat, knew exactly why he was there. The land all those business people were fighting over wasn't just a piece of valuable property in upstate New York. It was the place where he was born, where his mother planted the first coffee tree, where his father taught him the values he still carried today. And most importantly, it was where his daughter had taken her first steps before leaving forever. The hall sparkled under the light of imported crystal chandeliers. Men and women dressed in expensive suits circulated among the round tables, glasses of French champagne in hand, discussing figures that could feed entire families for years. The smell of imported perfumes mixed with the aroma of canapés served by uniformed waiters who moved silently among the guests. Thomas stopped at the entrance, observing that world which he had once scorned, but which had now been part of his reality for over 2 decades. His red and blue plaid shirt, sewn by his late wife Catherine, clashed starkly with the fine fabrics dominating the room. His worn leather boots echoed against the Italian marble as he walked toward the center of the hall. "Excuse me, sir," said a tall, burly security guard intercepting his path. "This is a private event. I believe you're in the wrong place." "I'm not mistaken," replied Thomas in his deep, measured voice, typical of the countryside. "I came to talk about the land you all want to buy up in Rochester." The security guard looked him up and down, noting the simple clothes and the country accent. A scornful smile formed on his lips. "Look, mister, what was your name again?" "Thomas Blackwell." "Mr. Blackwell, this event is only for investors and business people. Perhaps you'd like to speak with someone outside at the reception." But before he could be escorted out, a sharp female voice cut through the air like a blade. "What's going on here?" Victoria Hamilton approached with firm steps, her 6-inch heels hammering the floor authoritatively. At 45, she was considered one of the most ambitious executives in the New York real estate market. Her black hair was pulled into a perfect bun, and her expensive navy blue dress hugged her slender figure. She had dedicated the last 15 years of her life to building her reputation, sacrificing family, friendships, and even her own happiness in the name of professional success. "This gentleman says he came to talk about the Rochester property," explained the security guard. Victoria looked Thomas up and down, her expression shifting from curiosity to cruel amusement. She had spent months pulling strings and spending fortunes on insider information about that property. The idea that this simple man had any connection to the deal of the year seemed hilarious to her. "Oh, of course," she said, raising her voice so other guests could hear. "And let me guess, you know the owner personally, don't you?" Some nearby business people began to turn around, drawn by the unusual situation. Victoria saw a perfect opportunity to show off and solidify her position as the main interested party in the land. "Actually," said Thomas calmly, "I've known every inch of that land since I was a child." "How interesting," Victoria clapped theatrically. "Everyone, come listen. Here we have an expert on the property we all want to buy." Gradually, a small circle formed around them. Richard Thompson, a New York City businessman in his 50s known for his questionable ventures, approached with a mocking smile. Beside him, Samantha Roberts, heiress to a traditional construction company, watched the scene with malicious interest. "And how did you end up here?" asked Richard, clearly amused. "By private limousine?" "By bus," replied Thomas without showing embarrassment. "I left early this morning from Rochester." The information sparked a wave of laughter among those present. Victoria took the opportunity to solidify his public humiliation. "By bus! How charming!" she said, her voice dripping with irony. "And tell me, my dear, what exactly do you know about that land that we, with all our resources and connections, don't?" Thomas took a deep breath, feeling a familiar pang in his chest. He had learned long ago that words could hurt more than any tool, but he also knew that sometimes It was necessary to endure pain to achieve a greater goal. "I know there's a freshwater spring in the northeast corner of the property," he said slowly. "I know the soil in the southern part is more clay, better for construction. And I know there's a 100-year-old jatoba tree right in the middle of the land, planted by a farmer over 100 years ago." The circle fell momentarily silent. Those details were too specific to be a coincidence. Richard and Samantha exchanged worried glances. "Anyone can look up that information online," Victoria said quickly, noticing the others' discomfort. "Isn't that right, everyone?" "Of course," Richard agreed, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out now continuing. It was at that moment that Jason Miller, a 22-year-old young man working as a waiter at the event, discreetly approached the group. Tall and thin, with always messy brown hair, he had grown up in a humble family from Rochester and knew the area well. Unlike the other staff who had been instructed to keep their distance from the guests, Jason had always found it hard to ignore injustices. "Excuse me," he said politely, offering a glass of water to Thomas. "Would you like to sit down? There's a free table over there in the corner." Victoria looked at the waiter with irritation. "No one asked for your opinion," she said curtly. "Return to your work." "I just thought that—" Jason began, but was interrupted. "You don't think anything," Richard said sharply. "Do what Mrs. Victoria said." Thomas accepted the glass of water and looked into the young waiter's eyes. There was something there that caught his attention, a genuine kindness that had become increasingly rare in recent years. "Thank you, son," he said simply. Jason nodded and moved away, but continued watching the situation from afar. Something about that older man sparked a strange familiarity in him, as if he had seen him before, though he couldn't remember where. Victoria, realizing she was losing control of the situation, decided to increase the pressure. Her eyes shone with a cruelty she had developed over years of fierce competition in the corporate world. "Well, since you seem to know so much about the land," she said in a honeyed voice, "perhaps you can tell us who the current owner is. I'm sure everyone here would be very interested to know." Thomas took a sip of water and looked her directly in the eyes. For a moment, she felt a strange sensation, as if those dark brown eyes could see through the carefully constructed facade she had built over the years. "The owner is a farmer who has suffered greatly in life," he said slowly. "He lost his wife 8 years ago, his only daughter 15 years ago. He worked his whole life on that land, built everything with his own hands, and now he's old, tired, with no family to leave his inheritance to." The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. There was something in Thomas's voice, a genuine pain that cut through the laughter and mockery. For a moment, even Victoria hesitated. "What a sad story," said Samantha with false compassion. "But that doesn't change the fact that the land is for sale, does it?" "It is," confirmed Thomas. "But the old farmer isn't just interested in the money. He wants to make sure the land goes to someone who understands its value, someone who respects what it represents." Richard let out a forced laugh. "What nonsense," he said. "Business is business. Sentimental value doesn't pay the bills." "Maybe it doesn't pay the bills," said Thomas, "but it defines a person's character." The phrase echoed through the circle like a stone thrown into still waters. Victoria felt a pang of irritation. How dare that man speak to her about character? He had no idea of the sacrifices she had made, the humiliations she had endured to get where she was. "What cheap philosophy," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "I bet you never had to fight for anything in your life, always lived protected in your little rural world, without facing the reality of the business world." Victoria's words hit Thomas like punches to the stomach. If she only knew how many sleepless nights he had spent worrying about bills to pay, how many times he had eaten only bread and coffee so his daughter could have milk on the table, how many dreams he had abandoned to care for his sick wife during the last 3 years of her life. "You're right," he said calmly. "I never had to fight for anything. Everything has always been very easy for me." The irony in his voice went unnoticed by those present, but Jason, who continued watching from afar, noticed. There was something deeply wrong with that situation, but he couldn't pinpoint what it was. At that moment, Evelyn Parker, the hotel manager, appeared near the group. At 58, Evelyn had worked in hospitality her entire life, starting as a maid and climbing the hierarchy through much effort and dedication. She was an observant woman who had learned to read people and situations accurately. When her eyes met Thomas's, Evelyn felt as if the world had stopped for a second. It had been 3 years since she had seen him in person, but she would recognize that face anywhere. Her heart raced and she had to lean against a pillar to keep from staggering. "My God," she murmured to herself. Evelyn knew exactly who that man was, but she also knew that his presence there, dressed that way and being publicly humiliated, was no coincidence. She had known Thomas long enough to understand that he always had a reason for everything he did. She approached the group slowly, trying to control her facial expression. She couldn't show recognition, at least not yet. Victoria, unaware of the manager's presence, continued her cruel performance. "You know what?" she said, addressing Thomas with a malicious smile. "I'm starting to feel sorry for you. You must have come here with so much hope, thinking you could be part of our world." She made a theatrical pause, looking around to make sure she had everyone's attention. "But the truth is, people like you don't belong here. Your place is out in the country, taking care of pigs and chickens, far from adults who understand serious business." Victoria's words echoed through the hall like a slap in the face. Some people at nearby tables stopped their conversations to witness the public humiliation. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, and in the momentary darkness, he saw the face of his daughter, Emily Grace, at 5 years old, running through the coffee plantation and laughing as he chased her playing hide-and-seek. "You're right," he said again, opening his eyes. "I really don't understand anything about serious business." Evelyn, who had approached close enough to hear everything, felt a mixture of admiration and concern. She knew Thomas well enough to know that his patience had limits, and those limits were being dangerously tested. Jason, unable to bear the injustice any longer, approached the group again, this time carrying a tray of canapes. "Would anyone like—" he began, but was brutally interrupted by Richard. "How many times do you need to be told to stay away from here?" shouted the businessman, causing several people to turn and look. "What's so hard to understand about simple orders?" Jason's face flushed with shame and anger. He had spent the last 4 years of his life working various jobs to pay for his agronomy degree, always treated as a second-class citizen by people who considered his social position inferior. "I just wanted to offer," he tried to explain. "Nobody wants anything from you," said Victoria with disdain. "And since you're here getting in the way, how about taking this gentleman outside? You might be useful for once in your life." Victoria's suggestion was met with laughter and applause from the other business people. Samantha even clapped exaggeratedly. "Great idea, Victoria," she said. "The two of you can keep each other company outside." Thomas watched Jason's humiliation and felt something ignite in his chest. Throughout his life, he had fought against injustices and disrespectful people, but recent years had taught him to choose his battles carefully. "The young man is just doing his job," he said calmly. "Oh, how cute," said Victoria sarcastically. "The two of you defending each other. It's like a comedy movie." Richard approached Thomas with a threatening expression. "Listen here, old man," he said in a low but audible voice for all. "You've already made the scene you wanted to make. Now get out of here before I call real security." It was at that moment that Evelyn decided to intervene. She could no longer stand by and watch the situation. "Is there a problem here?" she asked in her professional voice, addressing the group. Victoria turned to the manager with a superior smile. "No problem, Evelyn," she said, addressing the manager by her first name with forced familiarity. "Just some unwanted guests who need to be escorted to the exit." Evelyn looked directly at Thomas, and for a split second, their eyes met. She saw in them a mixture of pain, determination, and something that made her tremble, a patience that was reaching its end. "I see," said Evelyn carefully. "And this gentleman, how did he manage to enter the event?" "Good question," said Richard. "I wonder how this hotel's security let this situation get to this point." The indirect criticism of the hotel's management made Evelyn feel a pang of anger, but she maintained her neutral expression. "Sir, could you accompany me to the reception?" she asked Thomas. We need to clarify some things about your presence here. Thomas nodded slowly. Of course, Miss Evelyn. You're in charge. The use of her name made the business people exchange glances. How did this simple man know the manager by name? Do you know each other? Asked Victoria suspiciously. All staff wear name tags, Evelyn said quickly. It's not hard to know my name. The explanation seemed to satisfy the group, although Samantha continued watching attentively. Well, said Victoria, clearly pleased with how things were unfolding, at least now we can get back to discussing serious matters. When Evelyn and Thomas began to move away, Jason hesitated for a moment before following them. Something inside him said that man wasn't what he appeared to be, and his curiosity was stronger than his fear of losing his job. Hey, wait up, Richard shouted to Jason. Where do you think you're going? I need to restock the canapes in the kitchen, Jason lied, holding up the empty tray. Then hurry up and come back to do your job properly, Victoria said impatiently. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. As they walked toward a more secluded corner of the hall, Evelyn struggled to control her emotions. It had been 3 years since she last saw Thomas in person, and today's circumstances brought back painful memories she preferred to keep buried. What are you doing here? She asked quietly when they reached a spot where they couldn't be heard. The same as always, Evelyn, Thomas replied calmly, trying to understand people's character before doing business with them. But like this, she insisted. Letting them humiliate you this way? Thomas looked back at the group of businessmen who had resumed their animated conversations, clearly pleased to have gotten rid of the nuisance. Sometimes you need to hit rock bottom to see who's really willing to help you climb back up, he said philosophically. Evelyn sighed deeply. She had known Thomas for 15 years since he bought his first property in New York City. She had watched his transformation from a simple farmer into one of the most respected businessmen in upstate New York, always maintaining his values and humility. Victoria Hamilton has been working for months to arrange the land purchase, Evelyn said quietly. She spent a fortune on insider information and is sure she'll close the deal. What kind of information? Thomas asked with interest. She believes she knows the owner personally. She has a contact who guaranteed the deal is practically done. Thomas smiled sadly. And what kind of contact would that be? A lawyer named Michael Turner. He assured her he has direct access to the owner and can mediate the sale for a 10% commission. Thomas's smile widened, but there was something melancholy in it. Michael Turner, he repeated slowly. Interesting. Evelyn knew him well enough to understand there was something important in that information. Do you know this Michael? She asked. Let's just say I've heard of him, Thomas said diplomatically. In fact, Michael Turner was a known con artist who had tried to pull various fraudulent schemes in the Rochester area in recent years. Thomas had been warned about him by the local sheriff, who kept a list of suspicious people trying to take advantage of rural property owners. At that moment, Jason approached them hesitantly, still carrying the empty tray as an excuse for being there. Excuse me, he said politely. I couldn't help overhearing part of your conversation and, well, I'm from Rochester too. Evelyn and Thomas turned to look at the young waiter. His light brown eyes shone with a mixture of curiosity and determination. You're from Rochester? Thomas asked with renewed interest. Born and raised there, Jason confirmed. My family has a small property in the rural area, and I study agronomy at the university. That's why I work here on weekends to pay for my studies. Evelyn observed the interaction between the two men with growing interest. There was something there she couldn't quite put her finger on. And what do you think about what's happening over there? Asked Thomas, gesturing toward the group of businessmen. Jason hesitated for a moment, clearly torn between keeping his job and his conscience. I think, he began slowly, that those people don't know what it means to work the land. For them, the property is just a number on a spreadsheet. They don't understand that every piece of land has history, has life. Jason's words struck Thomas unexpectedly. It was exactly the kind of thinking he had tried to instill in his daughter Emily Grace during the few years they had together. You speak like someone who truly understands, said Thomas, with a note of approval in his voice. My grandfather always told me that the land doesn't belong to anyone, continued Jason, gaining confidence. We belong to it. Our role is to care for it, protect it, and leave it for future generations in better condition than we found it. Evelyn watched Thomas's expression gradually change. For the first time since arriving at the hotel, his eyes seemed less burdened with pain. Your grandfather was a wise man, he said simply. He really was, agreed Jason, with a nostalgic smile. Unfortunately, he passed away last year. He left the property to my mother, but she can't maintain it. We're trying to sell it to someone who will continue caring for the land the way he did. This information further piqued Thomas's interest. And what kind of property is it? Small, just 20 acres, but it has a beautiful spring, some native fruit trees my grandfather planted 40 years ago, and a small wooden house he built himself, said Jason proudly. It's not worth much in money, but to our family, it's everything. Evelyn noticed that Thomas was absorbing every word with special attention. She recognized that look. It was the same one he had when he found something or someone that sparked his genuine interest. "And is your mother managing to hold on to the property?" asked Thomas. Jason's face darkened. "For now, yes, but the costs are getting difficult. Taxes, maintenance, all those things. And she's not young anymore, you know. 62 years old, worked her whole life as a housekeeper to support the family. And you? Can't you help?" "I help where I can," said Jason with a sigh. "But between college and work, I barely have time to breathe. And money. Well, the little I manage to save all goes toward my studies." Thomas nodded understandingly. He had been through similar situations during his youth, when he struggled to maintain the family property after his parents' death. "How old are you, son?" 22, sir. "And what year of college are you in?" "Final year," Jason replied with pride. "If all goes well, I'll graduate at the end of the year." "And after? Do you have plans?" Jason hesitated before answering. "Actually, I have a bit of a crazy dream," he said with an embarrassed smile. "I want to create a sustainable agriculture project, you know. Teach small farmers how to care for the land in a way that's profitable but doesn't destroy the environment." Thomas's eyes shone with a light Evelyn hadn't seen in years. "That doesn't seem crazy to me at all," he said. "It seems exactly the kind of project the world needs." At that moment, Victoria's shrill voice echoed through the hall, interrupting the conversation among the three. "Evelyn, where are you? I need to speak with you now." Evelyn sighed and looked at Thomas with an apologetic expression. "I need to go," she said, "but sir, please be careful. That woman is more dangerous than she seems." "Don't worry about me," said Thomas calmly. "I know exactly what I'm doing." When Evelyn stepped away, Jason was left alone with Thomas for the first time since they had met. "May I ask a question, sir?" said the young man hesitantly. "Of course, son. Do you really know the owner of that land they're trying to buy?" Thomas looked at Jason for a long moment before answering. "Yes, I do, very well, in fact." "And is it true he'll only sell to someone who respects the land?" "It's true," Thomas confirmed. "He spent his whole life caring for that place. He doesn't want to see it in the hands of speculators who only think about profit." Jason nodded understandingly. "I get that. It's like my grandfather always said, the land has a soul, and only those who have a soul too can take proper care of it." The young man's words deeply touched Thomas. It was exactly the kind of philosophy he had tried to instill in Emily Grace, and now he was hearing it from a stranger working as a waiter to pay for his studies. "Your grandfather was truly very wise," he said with emotion in his voice. Meanwhile, across the hall, Victoria was having a tense conversation with Evelyn. "What was that?" she asked irritably. "Why did it take you so long to get that man out of there?" "I needed to understand how he managed to get into the event," Evelyn explained diplomatically. "Security matters, you understand." "And did you find out anything?" Evelyn hesitated for a moment. "He said he knows the Rochester area very well. Apparently, he worked on rural properties in the area for years." "How typical," Victoria said disdainfully. "Probably a retired farmhand who thought he could come here and act important." "Perhaps," Evelyn said, although she knew the reality was quite different. "Well, anyway, thank you for handling the situation," Victoria said, clearly wanting to end the subject. Now I need to focus on what really matters. And what would that be? Victoria smiled with a confidence that Evelyn found unsettling. Tomorrow afternoon, I have a meeting with the legal representative of the property owner. Michael Turner has already assured me the deal is practically closed. Just need to sort out some bureaucratic details. Evelyn felt a knot in her stomach upon hearing that information. And are you sure this Michael Turner is trustworthy? Absolutely, Victoria said with conviction. He showed me documents, has power of attorney from the owner, knows all the details of the property. Besides, he only charged 10% commission, which is very reasonable for a deal of this size. Evelyn knew she should warn Victoria about the possible scam, but something stopped her. Maybe it was the way the executive had treated Thomas, or maybe it was her intuition that something bigger was happening there. I hope everything works out for you, she said diplomatically. It will, Victoria said with certainty. In 48 hours, that land will be mine. And when that happens, all the business people at this event will know that Victoria Hamilton always gets what she wants. While Victoria spoke about her grand plans, Thomas and Jason continued talking across the hall. May I ask something that might be indiscreet? Jason said hesitantly. Go ahead. Did you really come by bus all the way from Rochester? Thomas smiled. Yes, I did. I left home at 5 in the morning. But why? I mean, if you have some connection with the property owner, wouldn't it be easier to come by car or hire private transport? The question revealed Jason's natural intelligence, his ability to observe details and make connections. Sometimes, Thomas said thoughtfully, you need to do things the hard way to better understand the character of the people around you. How so? When you show up somewhere like this dressed in an expensive suit and driving an imported car, people treat you well because they want something from you. But when you show up simple, the way you really are, you see who people truly are. Jason reflected on those words for a moment. That makes sense, he said slowly. It's like my grandfather used to say, you only know a person's true character when they have nothing to gain by being good to us. Your grandfather was indeed very wise, repeated Thomas, increasingly impressed with the young man's maturity. At that moment, Richard Thompson approached the bar where they were talking, clearly drunk after several glasses of whiskey. Hey, you two, he shouted aggressively. Didn't I tell you to get out of here? Jason instinctively stepped back, but Thomas remained where he was. The young man is working, he said calmly, and I'm just talking with him. Working? Richard let out a sarcastic laugh. This is work? Chatting with a bum? The word bum hit Thomas like a punch in the stomach. Throughout his life he had worked since he was 8 years old, first helping his father on the farm, then building his own empire. He had never asked anyone for anything, never taken advantage of anyone. You don't know me, he said slowly, so you can't judge whether I'm a bum or not. I don't need to know, Richard said arrogantly. I just have to look. Old clothes, sloppy appearance, no manners. Bum, period. Jason felt anger boiling in his chest. He had grown up watching his mother be humiliated by arrogant bosses, and now he was witnessing the same injustice being applied to this man who had been kind to him. Mr. Thompson, he said courageously, I think you're being unfair. Richard turned to the young waiter with a furious expression. Do you have a hearing problem? He asked in a threatening voice. Didn't I already tell you to shut up and do your job? I just think... You don't think anything, shouted Richard, attracting the attention of several people nearby. You're a waiter, a nobody. Your opinion is worthless here. The public insult made Jason blush with shame and anger. Thomas, seeing the young man suffering, felt something ignite in his chest. The young man has better manners than many rich people out there, he said firmly. Oh, really? Richard stepped closer to Thomas with a threatening expression. And who are you to talk about manners, you ignorant old man? The word ignorant echoed through the space like a slap in the face. Thomas had built a library with over 3,000 books on his property, had studied business administration by correspondence, spoke 3 languages, and had read all the classics of American literature. But at that moment, dressed simply, he was just an ignorant old man to those people. Maybe I am ignorant, he said calmly. At least I don't need to humiliate others to feel important. The answer infuriated Richard even more. who was already agitated by the alcohol. "Listen here, you miserable man," he said, poking Thomas's chest with his index finger. "You've gone too far. Now you're going to learn to respect your superiors." It was at that moment that Evelyn reappeared, having realized the situation was getting out of control. "Is there a problem here?" she asked diplomatically. "The problem," Richard said without taking his eyes off Thomas, "is that this establishment lets any bum in here to bother paying customers." Evelyn felt anger rising in her throat, but maintained her professional expression. "Mr. Thompson, perhaps it would be best if we return to the main event area," she suggested. "I believe the other business people are waiting for your participation in the land discussions." The mention of the land briefly diverted Richard's attention. "Oh, yes," he said, straightening his jacket. "Important business. I can't waste time with this." He gestured dismissively toward Thomas and Jason before staggering away. When Richard was out of sight, Evelyn approached Thomas with a worried expression. "Sir, I think it's best if you leave," she said quietly. "The situation is getting tense and I don't want anything worse to happen." Thomas looked at her gratefully. "I know you're trying to protect me, Evelyn, and I truly appreciate that. But I need to stay a little longer." "Why?" she asked anxiously. "What do you hope to achieve by subjecting yourself to these humiliations?" Thomas glanced toward where Victoria and the other business people were gathered, enthusiastically discussing their proposals for the land. "Sometimes," he said, "you need to see the bottom of the well to understand who deserves to be at the top." Evelyn sighed, knowing she wouldn't be able to change his mind. "Then at least be careful," she pleaded, "and if you need anything, come find me." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. After Evelyn walked away, Jason approached Thomas with a confused expression. "Sir, may I ask a personal question?" "Of course. Why don't you defend yourself? I mean, those people are being very cruel, and you just stand there taking it all in silence." Thomas smiled sadly. "You know, son, when you've been through a lot in life, you learn that words only hurt if you let them. And sometimes it's important to let people show who they really are." "But that's not fair," Jason protested. "You don't deserve to be treated this way." "Perhaps not," Thomas agreed. "But justice isn't something that always happens when we want it to. Sometimes it takes a while." Jason reflected on those words, impressed by the wisdom and patience of this man he'd just met. "You remind me of my grandfather," he said suddenly. "How so?" "He also had that patience, that ability to see beyond appearances. He always said God has a special way of settling accounts." Thomas felt an unexpected emotion hearing those words. It had been a long time since he'd felt so genuinely understood by someone. "Your grandfather sounds like he was a very special man," he said affectionately. "He really was," Jason agreed with a nostalgic smile. "And you know what else? He always said the best way to know a person is to see how they treat those who can do nothing for them." The phrase struck Thomas deeply. It was exactly the philosophy that had guided his life for years, and it was also the criterion he was using at that event to evaluate the potential buyers for his land. "Your grandfather was indeed very wise," he said once more, but this time with special emotion in his voice. At that moment, Victoria returned to the center of the hall and clapped her hands to get everyone's attention. "Everyone, may I have your attention for a moment?" she said in an authoritative voice that cut through the side conversations. Gradually, the chatter subsided and all eyes turned toward her. Victoria was clearly enjoying her moment in the spotlight. "As you know," she continued, "we're all here interested in acquiring a very special property in Rochester, a unique opportunity that could transform our investment portfolios." There were murmurs of approval among the business people present. "I'm pleased to announce that after months of careful negotiations, I've managed to establish direct contact with the property owner's legal representative," said Victoria with a triumphant smile. "And I can report that negotiations are quite advanced." Richard, who had rejoined the main group, raised his glass toward Victoria. "Congratulations, Victoria," he said with a slightly slurred voice. "Always knew you could do it." "Thank you, Richard," she said graciously. "But I want to make clear that I haven't officially closed the deal yet, so if anyone here has a better offer than mine, there's still time." The statement was met with some ironic laughter. Everyone there knew Victoria had invested considerable time and resources in the transaction and would hardly be outdone by a competitor. Samantha Roberts, who had remained relatively quiet during the evening, decided to make her own statement. "Victoria, darling," she said with a sweet smile that didn't reach her eyes, "we all admire your persistence here, but perhaps you're being a bit presumptuous in assuming the deal is already sealed." Victoria turned to Samantha with a surprised expression. "What do you mean, Samantha?" "Well," said Samantha with false modesty, "I too have my contacts in the area, and I've learned the owner is a very particular man. He isn't easily impressed by money." "And where did you get that information?" asked Victoria with a note of irritation in her voice. "Let's just say I have my sources," Samantha said mysteriously, "and they told me the old farmer values the buyer's character more than the offer amount." Victoria let out a forced laugh. "What nonsense," she said. "Business is business. In the end, it all comes down to who offers more money." "Does it?" said Samantha with an enigmatic smile. The exchange of barbs between the two executives was attracting everyone's attention. Across the hall, Thomas and Jason were watching the discussion with interest. "What do you think?" whispered Jason. "Who will manage to buy the land?" Thomas observed the two women for a moment before answering. "Neither of them," he said calmly. "Why?" "Because they're both making the same mistake. They think they know the owner, but they actually have no idea who he is." Jason looked at Thomas with renewed curiosity. "And do you really know the owner?" "I do," Thomas confirmed. "Very well. And what's he like? I mean, what kind of person?" Thomas took his time answering, as if carefully choosing his words. "He's a man who's suffered greatly in life," he said finally. "Lost the people he loved most. Worked hard to build everything he has, and he's learned that money without character is worthless." "He must be a very special person," Jason said with admiration. "He has his flaws," Thomas said honestly. "Sometimes he's too stubborn, sometimes he holds grudges longer than he should, but deep down he just wants to make sure what he built goes to someone who deserves it." Meanwhile, the argument between Victoria and Samantha was heating up. "Samantha," Victoria said in a cold voice, "if you have any relevant information, I suggest you share it. Otherwise, stop creating mystery where there is none." "It's not mystery, darling," Samantha said with false sweetness. "It's just prudence. Some people do business differently." Richard, increasingly drunk, decided to intervene in the argument. "You two are wasting your time," he said with slurred speech. "In the end, I'm the one who's going to win. I have more money than both of you combined." Victoria and Samantha turned to him with expressions of contempt. "Richard," Victoria said with forced patience, "it's not just about money. You need strategy, contacts, negotiation skills." "Nonsense," said Richard, swirling his whiskey glass in the air. "Rich is rich, poor is poor. In the end, money speaks louder than anything else." His words were heard throughout the hall, including by Thomas and Jason. "What kind of person is that?" murmured Jason with disgust. "The kind who thinks they can buy everything and everyone," replied Thomas with sadness. "And unfortunately," he continued after a pause, "sometimes they actually succeed." Jason looked at the older man with concern. "You seem sad." "It's just that sometimes you lose faith in humanity," Thomas said honestly. "You see so much greed, so much selfishness, that you start to think there's no one good left in the world." "But there is," Jason said with conviction. "You are a good person. Mrs. Evelyn also seems to be, and there are plenty of good people out there. They're just sometimes hidden." The young man's words deeply touched Thomas. He had spent so much time around calculating and self-interested businessmen that he had forgotten what it was like to talk to someone genuine. "You're right, son," he said with a more sincere smile. "There are still good people in the world." At that moment, a new participant arrived at the event. He was a man in his 40s, well-dressed, but without the ostentation of the other businessmen. His presence immediately caught Victoria's attention, who approached him with interest. Dr. Michael, she said with exaggerated enthusiasm. What a surprise to see you here. The man smiled in a way that didn't inspire trust. Victoria, my dear, he said in an oily voice, I couldn't miss the opportunity to see my favorite client in action. Michael Turner had the appearance of someone who had learned to dress well to impress, but there was something artificial about his presentation. His small dark eyes moved constantly, never settling on one person for too long. Everyone, Victoria said to the group, let me introduce Dr. Michael Turner, the lawyer who is mediating my negotiation with the landowner. There were murmurs of interest among the businessmen present. Samantha watched Michael with special attention, trying to assess if he was truly trustworthy. Dr. Michael, said Richard, approaching with difficulty due to the alcohol, do you know the landowner personally? Of course, Michael said with excessive confidence. We're old acquaintances. He gave me full power of attorney to negotiate the sale. And what is he like? Asked Samantha with genuine interest. Michael paused theatrically before answering. A simple farmer, not very educated, he said with a condescending smile. The kind of person who is easily impressed by big numbers, very easy to convince. Across the hall, Thomas heard every word of Michael's description of him. His fists clenched involuntarily, but he managed to keep a neutral expression. What kind of person is that? Murmured Jason, who had also heard. The kind who makes money by deceiving others, Thomas replied quietly. Victoria, clearly pleased with Michael's presentation, decided to consolidate her position. As you can see, she said to the group, I have the direct contact and the legal representation needed to close this deal. I doubt anyone here has better access than I do. Michael nodded in approval. Victoria was very smart to seek me out, he said. She's exactly the kind of visionary businesswoman my client is looking for. And when do you plan to close the deal? Asked Richard with poorly disguised envy. Tomorrow afternoon, Victoria said triumphantly. Dr. Michael has already scheduled a meeting to sign the papers. And the offer amount, insisted Samantha. Victoria exchanged a look with Michael before answering. 15 million, she said proudly. That's a generous amount for rural land, even considering its potential. There were exclamations of surprise among those present. It was indeed a considerable sum. And Dr. Michael's commission? Asked Richard with curiosity. Only 10%, said Michael quickly. A very fair amount for a negotiation of this size. Thomas, hearing those numbers, felt a mix of anger and sadness. $1.5 million in commission for a scam. It was more money than many families saw in their entire lives. Sir, whispered Jason, don't you think you should warn them about this, Michael? Thomas thought about the question for a moment. Sometimes, he said, people need to learn the hard way. It's the only way they understand the consequences of their actions. But she's going to lose a lot of money, insisted Jason. She will, agreed Thomas. But maybe she'll learn something in the process. Meanwhile, Michael was consolidating his position as a trustworthy intermediary. My client is a simple man, he told the group. He was born and raised on that land, never left the region. He doesn't understand much about complex business, so he gave me full authority to handle the sale. Every word was a lie, and Thomas had to make a considerable effort not to intervene. And is he in a hurry to sell? Asked Samantha. Yes, said Michael with conviction. He's old, with no family to leave an inheritance. He wants to retire and live out his final years in peace. The description was partially correct, but Michael's intentions were completely different from Thomas's real motivations. Perfect, said Victoria with satisfaction. Then we'll settle everything tomorrow. Evelyn, who had been observing the conversation from a distance, approached the group at that moment. Excuse me, she said politely. Would you like anything else? Michael looked at her with immediate interest. Are you the hotel manager? He asked. Yes, sir. Great, he said with a smile that made Evelyn uncomfortable. Perhaps we can talk later about some events I'm organizing. Evelyn nodded politely, but something about the way Michael looked at her bothered her deeply. Of course, sir. You can find me at the front desk whenever you like. When Evelyn walked away, Michael followed her with his eyes in a way that made several people notice. Beautiful woman, he commented to the group. Michael, said Victoria with a note of warning in her voice. "Let's keep our focus on business." Of course," he said quickly. "Just an observation." But Thomas had noticed Michael's behavior toward Evelyn, and it added another layer to his growing aversion for the fake lawyer. At that moment, Jason was called by another waiter to help in the kitchen, leaving Thomas alone for the first time since he arrived at the event. He took the opportunity to move closer to the group of business people, staying on the periphery where he could hear the conversations without being noticed. "Dr. Michael," Richard was saying, "are you sure none of us can make a counteroffer?" "Well," said Michael, clearly considering the possibilities for additional profit. "Technically, my client hasn't signed anything yet. If someone made a significantly higher offer—" Victoria turned to him with an expression of alarm. "Michael, we have an agreement," she said urgently. "Calm down, Victoria," he said with a reassuring smile. "Our agreement still stands. I'm just being transparent about the possibilities." "How much would a significantly higher offer be?" asked Samantha with renewed interest. Michael pretended to think for a moment. "Well, considering the current proposal is 15 million, I believe something around 20 million would catch my client's attention." Brian nearly choked on his whiskey. 20 million, he said. "For a rural property?" "A rural property with exceptional potential," corrected Michael. "Prime location, access to major highways, soil suitable for various types of developments." Thomas, listening to that surreal negotiation about his own property, felt a mix of disbelief and sadness. It wasn't the first time he had witnessed human greed, but the coldness with which Michael manipulated the situation negatively impressed him. "I might consider an offer in that range," said Samantha cautiously. "Samantha!" exclaimed Victoria with indignation. "That's unfair." "Darling," said Samantha with a cold smile, "you yourself said business is business. If I can offer more, why not?" The tension between the two women was becoming palpable. Michael observed the situation with poorly concealed satisfaction, clearly enjoying the conflict he had created. "Well," said Brian, trying to insert himself into the dispute, "if we're talking about higher offers, I'm also interested." "How wonderful," said Michael with false enthusiasm. "A real competition. My client will be very pleased to know his property is so valued." Victoria realized she was losing control of the situation she had dominated all evening. "Dr. Michael," she said with a tense voice, "we invested months in this negotiation. I have commitments made, people counting on me. You can't just change the rules in the middle of the game." "Victoria, my dear," said Michael with false compassion, "I understand your position. But I need to defend my client's interests. If someone is willing to pay more, it's my obligation to inform him." Michael's manipulation was so evident that even some people not directly involved in the negotiation began to feel uncomfortable. "So, what do you propose?" asked Samantha. "An informal bidding," said Michael with enthusiasm. "Each interested party makes their final offer, and I take everything to my client to decide." "And when would that decision be?" asked Brian. "Still tomorrow," said Michael. "I scheduled a meeting with him for 2 in the afternoon. I can take all the offers and have an answer the same day." Victoria was clearly desperate. She had bet her entire professional reputation on that transaction. "Dr. Michael," she said almost pleading, "if it's a matter of value, I can consider increasing my offer." "How much would you be willing to offer?" asked Michael, his eyes gleaming with greed. Victoria hesitated, mentally calculating her available resources. 18 million, she finally said. "It's the maximum I can do." 22, said Samantha immediately. 25, declared Brian, slightly staggering. Michael could barely contain his excitement. If he could convince these people to transfer money to an account controlled by him, he would be rich for the rest of his life. "Excellent," he said with enthusiasm. 3 excellent offers. I'm sure my client will be very satisfied." Thomas, watching that madness from afar, felt a deep sadness. There were people fighting over something they didn't understand, trusting someone who planned to rob them, driven only by greed and vanity. At that moment, Jason returned from the kitchen and approached him. "Sir, did something happen? You look even sadder." I'm seeing people getting ready to be deceived, said Thomas with regret, and there's nothing I can do to stop it. Why not? Asked Jason with naivety. Because sometimes people need to fall to learn how to get up, said Thomas philosophically. Meanwhile, Michael was explaining the procedures for the supposed bidding. To ensure the seriousness of the proposals, he said, my client requires a sign of good faith. 10% of the proposed amount transferred to a special account until the deal is finalized. Victoria, Samantha, and Richard exchanged glances. It was an unusual demand, but not entirely outside the norm for major business deals. And if our proposal isn't accepted? Asked Samantha cautiously. The money is fully refunded the same day, said Michael with rehearsed sincerity. It's just a way to ensure we're not wasting time with unserious proposals. How long would we have to make the transfer? Asked Victoria. Until noon tomorrow, said Michael. That way I can present everything to my client at the afternoon meeting. Richard, who was getting increasingly drunk, was the first to agree. Perfect, he said with a slurred voice. I'll transfer $2.5 million today. Excellent, said Michael, barely able to hide his satisfaction. Victoria and Samantha hesitated a bit more, but competitiveness won out. I also accept the terms, said Victoria finally. And me too, said Samantha after a pause. Michael took a business card from his pocket and handed one to each of them. Here are the details for the special account, he said, and my phone number for any questions. Thomas watched Michael distributing the cards and felt a deep anger. That man was about to steal millions of dollars from people who, despite all their flaws, were hard-working individuals who had built their fortunes through effort. Sir, whispered Jason, I think I should warn them. This seems very suspicious. It seems that way because it is, confirmed Thomas. But do you think they would believe me? Jason looked at the group of business people who were excitedly discussing the transfer details and understood Thomas's point. Probably not, he admitted. Exactly, said Thomas sadly. Sometimes greed blinds people to the risks. Meanwhile, Michael was consolidating his criminal plans. Well, everyone, he said to the group, I believe we have everything settled. Tomorrow afternoon, one of you will be the new owner of one of the most valuable properties in upstate New York. Victoria forced a smile, but the tension was visible on her face. Dr. Michael, she said, can I really count on your professional discretion? This deal is very important for my career. Absolutely, said Michael with false sincerity. Professional secrecy is sacred to me. Samantha and Richard also seemed tense, each mentally calculating the consequences of their proposals. And if we have any questions during the night? Asked Samantha. You can call me anytime, said Michael, tapping his phone. I'm always available for my clients. It was at that moment that Evelyn approached the group again. Excuse me, she said politely, but the event is coming to an end. We would need to start organizing the closing. Michael looked at her with the same uncomfortable interest as before. Of course, he said, but before that, can I have a few minutes with you? I have some questions about the hotel's services. Evelyn hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the request. Perhaps it would be better to talk tomorrow, she said diplomatically. Right now I'm busy with the event's closing. But it's just a minute, insisted Michael, moving closer to her in an invasive way. Thomas, observing the situation, felt a wave of protectiveness toward Evelyn. He had known her for years and respected her as a professional and as a person. The lady said she's busy, he said loudly, approaching the group for the first time since the initial humiliations. Michael turned to him with an expression of surprise and irritation. Who are you? He asked rudely. Someone who knows how to recognize when a person doesn't want to talk, Thomas Blackwell replied calmly. Victoria, noticing that the problem had returned, approached with an expression of indignation. I thought you had already left, she said to Thomas. Why are you still here? Because I haven't finished what I came to do, he replied simply. Michael observed the interaction with growing interest. Is this the farmer who's been causing trouble all evening? He asked Victoria. Exactly, Victoria said with contempt. A troublemaker who thinks he knows something about the land we're negotiating. Michael studied Thomas for a moment, his small eyes trying to assess whether that man could represent any kind of threat to his plans. And what exactly do you know about the land? He asked with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. Thomas looked directly into Michael's eyes for a long moment before answering. "I know that you never spoke with the real owner," he said calmly. The statement fell upon the group like a bomb. Michael paled momentarily before composing himself. "What nonsense," he said with a forced laugh. "Of course I spoke with him. I have a power of attorney, documents, everything in order." "Forged documents," Thomas said with certainty, "and a power of attorney that isn't worth the paper it's printed on." Victoria looked between Michael and Thomas with growing anxiety. "Dr. Michael," she said urgently, "you can prove you have legal authorization to negotiate, can't you?" "Of course I can," Michael said, but his voice carried a note of desperation. "The documents are all registered at the county clerk's office." "At which county clerk's office?" Thomas asked calmly. Michael hesitated for a fatal moment before answering. At the Rochester County Clerk's office," he said finally. "Which of the three?" Thomas insisted. The question caught Michael completely off guard. He didn't know there were 3 county clerk's offices in the city. The main one," he said vaguely. Thomas smiled sadly. "There is no main county clerk's office in Rochester," he said. "There are 3 county clerk's offices, each with its specialty. If you had really dealt with documents from the region, you would know that." The silence that followed was deafening. Michael was clearly panicking, while Victoria, Samantha, and Richard began to realize that something was very wrong. Who are you?" Michael asked with a trembling voice. Thomas didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked around the hall, observing the tense faces of the business people, Evelyn's worried expression, and Jason's attentive gaze. "I'm someone who knows the true owner of that land very well," he said finally. "And I can guarantee that he never gave you or anyone else power of attorney." Michael tried one last desperate move. You must be confused," he said with a faltering voice. "Maybe you know another owner, another property." "No," Thomas said firmly. "I know exactly the land you're talking about. 500 acres in the rural area of Rochester, with a spring in the northeast corner, clay soil in the southern part, and a 100-year-old jatoba tree in the center of the property." The precise description left everyone speechless. Michael was visibly sweating. How do you know that?" he stammered. "Because," Thomas said slowly, looking into the eyes of each person present, "I am Thomas Blackwell, and that land is mine." The silence that followed was absolute. For a moment, the only sound in the hall was the distant noise of traffic on the street. Victoria was the first to react. That's impossible," she said in a weak voice. You're just a poor farmer," Thomas completed. "An ignorant hick? A bum?" Each word hit Victoria like a slap in the face, reminding her of all the humiliations she had inflicted during the evening. I didn't know," she began, but Thomas interrupted her. "No, you knew exactly what you were doing," he said with sadness. "You all knew. You chose to humiliate someone you considered inferior, without caring about his feelings." Michael, realizing his scheme had completely collapsed, tried to slip away discreetly, but Thomas stopped him with a look. "You're not going anywhere," he said firmly. "You tried to pull a scam that could have cost these people millions." I can explain," stammered Michael. "There's no need to explain anything," said Thomas. "I've already perfectly understood your intentions." Richard, who was still reeling from the shock of the revelation, approached unsteadily. So you're really the owner?" he asked with difficulty. "Yes, I am," confirmed Thomas, "and I came here tonight to personally meet those interested in buying my property." "And what did you think?" asked Samantha in a small voice. Thomas looked at each of them before answering. "I found exactly what I expected to find," he said with regret. "People who value money more than character. People who think they can humiliate others because they consider them inferior." Victoria tried to approach him with a desperate expression. "Mr. Blackwell," she said in a trembling voice, I made a terrible mistake. I didn't know who you were. If you had known, you would have treated me well, only out of self-interest," interrupted Thomas. not out of politeness or basic respect for another human being. But I can. I can make it up to you, insisted Victoria. I can increase my offer, I can— Victoria, said Thomas calmly, you've already shown who you really are. Money doesn't change character. Michael, seeing that the situation was completely lost for him, tried once again to slip away, but this time Evelyn intercepted him. You're not going anywhere, she said firmly. You tried to pull $1 million scam right in front of me. Do you think I'll let that slide? I haven't done anything illegal yet, said Michael desperately. I haven't received any money from anyone. But you tried, said Thomas, and that's enough to involve the proper authorities. Michael realized he was cornered and made one last desperate attempt. Look, he said to Thomas, we can make a deal. I disappear and you keep your property. No one needs to know anything. Many people already know, said Thomas, pointing to the business people present, and I don't make deals with criminals. It was at that moment that Jason approached the group, having observed the entire revelation from a distance. Mr. Blackwell, he said, with a mixture of admiration and confusion, are you really the owner of the land? Yes, son, confirmed Thomas with a warmer smile than he had shown all evening. But why didn't you say so from the beginning? Asked Jason. Because I wanted to see the true character of the people interested in the property, explained Thomas, and also because I wanted to find someone who would treat me well without knowing who I was. Jason reflected on those words for a moment. And did you find someone? Thomas looked at the young waiter affectionately. Yes, I did, he said. I found someone who offered me water when I was being humiliated. Someone who defended me even at the risk of his own job. Someone who has the right values about land and life. The young man blushed at the praise, finally understanding what had happened throughout the evening. Victoria, watching the interaction between Thomas and Jason, felt a pang of desperation. Mr. Blackwell, she said almost pleadingly, please give me a second chance. I can prove I'm a better person than I showed today. Thomas Blackwell looked at her with a mixture of pity and sadness. Victoria, he said gently, second chances are for those who make mistakes due to inexperience or nervousness. You humiliated a stranger for pleasure because you felt superior. That's not a mistake. It's character. The words hit Victoria like punches to the stomach. She had fought so long to get where she was, sacrificed so much, and now saw everything crumbling because of her own behavior. But I worked so hard for this, she said with tears in her eyes. This business meant everything to me. It was everything to you, Thomas confirmed, but it meant nothing to you. You only saw numbers, profit, status. You didn't see the history, the values, the meaning of the land. Samantha, who had remained relatively quiet since the revelation, tried a different approach. Mr. Blackwell, she said with forced humility, I acknowledge I made mistakes tonight, but I'm a serious businesswoman with a solid reputation in the market. Perhaps we could talk more calmly at another time. Thomas observed her for a moment before answering. Samantha, he said, you may be a competent businesswoman, but today you showed you lack the respect for human dignity that I look for in a buyer. Richard, still staggering but trying to maintain his dignity, made his own attempt. Thomas, he said, trying to sound familiar, I think we had a misunderstanding tonight. Among business people, these things happen. We can forget everything and start over. Richard, Thomas said patiently, there was no misunderstanding. You called me a bum and ignorant. You humiliated a young worker. You showed exactly who you are when you think you can afford to be cruel. Richard tried to protest, but Thomas continued. And besides, he said, you're clearly drunk. What kind of serious business can be done with someone in this state? The observation made Richard realize his own condition. He looked around the hall as if seeing everything for the first time, and an expression of shame crossed his face. Michael, who had remained silent during the last exchanges, tried one last desperate move. Thomas, he said, trying to sound conciliatory, I think there was a big misunderstanding here. I truly believed I had authorization to negotiate your property. Someone gave me wrong information. Thomas looked at him with an expression mixing pity and disgust. Michael, he said calmly, I know your reputation in the region. You've tried to pull similar scams on at least 3 other property owners in the last 2 years. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was premeditated crime." You can't prove that," Michael said desperately. "Yes, I can," Thomas said with certainty. "I have contacts at the Rochester Police Department who will be very interested in talking to you." Michael realized he was completely lost. He looked around the hall like a cornered animal, searching for an exit that didn't exist. Evelyn, who had watched the whole situation unfold, approached Thomas. "Sir," she said quietly, "what would you like me to do about him?" Thomas thought for a moment before answering. "Call security to make sure he doesn't leave until the authorities arrive," he said, "and please keep him away from the other people." Evelyn nodded and made a discreet signal to 2 security guards nearby. They approached Michael with professional determination. "Sir," one of them said to Michael, "you need to come with us to the reception for clarification." Michael tried to protest, but the security guards gave him no option. He was escorted out of the hall under the watchful eyes of everyone present. With Michael removed from the situation, attention turned completely to Thomas and the business people who had tried to negotiate with him. "What now?" asked Victoria in a weak voice. "What will happen to the land?" Thomas looked at her, then at Samantha and Richard, and finally at Jason, who had remained by his side throughout the revelation. "The land is still for sale," he said finally, "but not to any of you." The words fell upon the 3 business people like a final sentence. Victoria felt her legs weaken and had to lean on a nearby table. "But, Mr. Blackwell," said Samantha, trying one last time, "don't you think you're being too harsh? We've all made mistakes, but we're hard-working people, serious business people." "You are competent business people," Thomas agreed, "but today you showed you don't have the values I'm looking for. It's not a matter of professional competence, it's a matter of personal character." Richard tried to intervene once more. "Thomas, be reasonable," he said, his voice still slurred. "Business is business. You can't mix personal feelings with investment opportunities." Richard's statement made Thomas smile sadly. "Richard," he said, "it's exactly that kind of thinking that convinces me I made the right decision. For you, business and character are separate things. For me, they're inseparable." Victoria, realizing she was losing the final battle, tried an emotional approach. "Mr. Blackwell," she said with real tears in her eyes, "I know I made terrible mistakes tonight, but please, understand my position. I'm a woman, fighting in a world dominated by men. Sometimes I need to be tougher, more aggressive to be taken seriously." Thomas observed her carefully, and for the first time since the event began, his expression showed some understanding. "Victoria," he said gently, "I understand the difficulties you face as a woman in the business world. My wife also faced prejudices and obstacles throughout her life." Victoria felt a glimmer of hope. "So you can understand why—" "I can understand the pressures you face," interrupted Thomas, "but I can't accept you using those pressures as justification for humiliating other people. There are many strong women who manage to be successful without losing their humanity." Thomas's words cut deeply. Victoria realized she had lost much more than a business deal that night. She had lost an opportunity to know herself better. "What can I do to redeem myself?" she asked sincerely. "Nothing," said Thomas kindly but firmly. "At least not with me, but perhaps you can learn something from this experience for the future." Samantha, seeing that Victoria had failed in her attempt at redemption, decided to try a more practical approach. "Mr. Blackwell," she said, "if you don't want to sell to us, at least tell us, who do you intend to sell to?" Thomas looked around the hall, his eyes passing over the defeated business people, over Evelyn, who was watching everything with interest, and finally stopping at Jason. "To someone who demonstrated respect for the land and for people," he said. "Someone who understands that rural property isn't just an investment, but a responsibility." Everyone followed his gaze and realized he was looking at Jason. "Me?" said the young waiter with disbelief. "But sir, I don't have the money to buy land of that value." Thomas smiled for the first time since revealing his identity. "Jason," he said, "you spent the entire night demonstrating exactly the values I'm looking for. You treated a stranger with respect, stood up for what's right even while risking your job, and showed true understanding about the meaning of the land. But I'm just a student," protested Jason. "I work as a waiter to pay for college, and that shows your character," said Thomas. "You fight for what you want. You don't put others down to feel superior." Victoria, overhearing that conversation, felt a mix of anger and despair. "This is ridiculous," she burst out. "You're going to hand over a property worth millions to a waiter. That makes no sense at all." Thomas turned to her with a stern expression. "Victoria," he said, "your reaction only confirms I made the right decision. For you, a person's worth is measured by their bank account, not their character." "But be realistic," she insisted. "How is he going to take care of a property this size? How will he develop it?" "The same way I did 40 years ago," said Thomas calmly, "with hard work, dedication, and respect for the land." Jason, still in shock at the direction the conversation was taking, tried to intervene. "Mr. Blackwell," he said nervously, "I really appreciate the trust, but I truly can't afford to buy your property. And even if I could, I wouldn't know how to manage something so big." Thomas approached the young man and put a hand on his shoulder. "Jason," he said in a fatherly tone, "when I started, I didn't know how to manage a large property either. I didn't have money either, but I had something more important: determination and the right values." "But—" "Let me make a proposal," Thomas interrupted. "How about instead of a traditional sale, we form a partnership?" "How so?" asked Jason curiously. "You would come in as a managing partner," explained Thomas. "You would take care of the property, develop your sustainable agriculture projects, and gradually take full ownership, like a kind of inheritance earned through hard work." The proposal left everyone in the room speechless. Jason seemed unable to believe what he was hearing. You would really do that? You?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I would," confirmed Thomas. "But on one condition. You would have to prove you are worthy of this trust, by working hard, treating the land with respect, and always upholding the values you showed today." Jason felt tears welling up in his eyes. He was being given the opportunity to fulfill all his professional dreams. I don't know what to say," he murmured. "Say you accept," said Thomas with a paternal smile, "and that you're willing to work hard to deserve this chance." "I accept," said Jason enthusiastically, his tears now flowing freely. "Yes, sir, I accept, and I promise I won't let you down." Evelyn, who had watched the entire conversation with growing emotion, approached the two men. "Mr. Blackwell," she said affectionately, "you have just changed this young man's life forever." "No," said Thomas, looking at Jason. "He changed mine. He reminded me that there are still good people in the world." Victoria, Samantha, and Richard watched that scene with a mixture of disbelief and defeat. They had lost the opportunity of a lifetime to a young waiter who didn't even know it existed a few hours before. "This is crazy," murmured Samantha to herself. Thomas heard the comment and turned to her. "Samantha," he said, "maybe it is crazy, but it's the craziness of believing that character is worth more than money, and it's a craziness that has brought me far more satisfaction in life than any purely financial deal." Richard, who had spent the last few minutes in silence processing everything that had happened, finally spoke. "Thomas," he said in a more sober voice, I think you're right. I behaved like a fool tonight." Thomas looked at him in surprise. It was the first sign of genuine reflection he had seen from any of the three business people. "Richard," he said, "recognizing your own mistakes is the first step toward change." "But it's too late for me, isn't it?" asked Richard with genuine sadness. Thomas thought for a moment before answering. "For this business, yes," he said honestly, "but not for your life. You can still choose to be a better person from now on." Richard nodded slowly, clearly reflecting on the consequences of his actions. Victoria, observing the interaction between Thomas and Richard, felt a final pang of hope. "And what about me, Mr. Blackwell?" she asked tentatively. "Is it too late for me too?" Thomas looked at her for a long moment before responding. "Victoria," he said finally, "you're an intelligent and determined woman. You have qualities that could do much good in the world if properly directed. But, she asked, sensing there was more to be said, but today you showed that your ambition has overtaken your humanity, he said sadly. And that's a dangerous path that could lead you to become someone you won't even recognize. The words struck Victoria deeply. She thought of the woman she had been years ago, full of dreams and ideals, and compared her to the cold, calculating executive she had become. "How do I get back to who I was?" she asked sincerely. "That's something only you can discover," said Thomas gently. "But the first step is to recognize you've lost your way, and you've just taken that step." Jason, who had observed this entire emotional exchange, approached Victoria with a compassionate expression. "Miss Hamilton," he said hesitantly, "I know today was a difficult day for you, but perhaps this is an opportunity to discover new paths." Victoria looked at the young man who had just stolen her dream business and surprisingly felt no anger. She felt something akin to admiration. "You're truly special," she said sincerely. "Thomas chose well." "Thank you," said Jason modestly, "and I hope you find your own special opportunity soon." The young man's generosity touched not only Victoria, but also Samantha and Richard, who recognized the stark contrast between his emotional maturity and the behavior they had displayed during the evening. Thomas observed this interaction with satisfaction. He was seeing exactly the kind of character he had sought his entire life, the ability to be generous even in moments of victory. "Jason," he said with paternal pride, "you've just confirmed I made the right decision." At that moment, Evelyn approached the group with an expression of discreet urgency. "Mr. Blackwell," she said quietly, "the authorities have arrived to speak about Michael. Would you like to give your statement now?" Thomas nodded. "Of course," he said. "It's important to resolve this situation properly." He turned to Jason. "Son," he said, "would you like to accompany me? After all, you're now my partner." Jason smiled, still hardly believing the radical change his life had taken in a single night. "Of course, Mr. Blackwell," he said. "Wherever you go, I'll go." As Thomas and Jason headed to the reception, accompanied by Evelyn, Victoria, Samantha, and Richard, were left alone in the hall that was being dismantled by the hotel staff. "Can you believe what just happened?" asked Samantha quietly. "I'm still trying to process everything," admitted Richard. "But I think we learned an important lesson tonight." Victoria nodded slowly. "Yes," she said, "we did. The question is, what will we do with this lesson?" The three business people remained silent for several minutes, each reflecting on the evening's events and their implications for their lives and careers. Meanwhile, in the hotel lobby, Thomas was giving a statement to two investigators from the local police who had been called to handle the attempted scam by Michael. "Mr. Blackwell," one of the investigators was saying, "can you confirm that you never authorized this Michael Turner to negotiate your property?" "I completely confirm," said Thomas. "I've never seen this man before in my life, never spoken to him, never authorized any kind of negotiation. And the documents he claimed to have?" "Certainly forged," Thomas said with certainty. "I never signed any power of attorney, and all my official documents are kept in my office in Rochester." The investigator noted everything carefully. "And the victims? Did they transfer any money?" "No," said Thomas. "Luckily, I managed to expose the scam before any financial transaction took place." "You were very brave to expose yourself like that," commented the second investigator. "It could have been dangerous. Sometimes," Thomas said philosophically, "the risks worth taking are those that protect other people." Jason, who had remained by Thomas's side throughout the statement, felt a renewed wave of admiration for the man he had chosen as a partner. "Any more questions for Mr. Blackwell?" asked the first investigator. "Not for now," he said, closing his notepad. "But we might need to get in touch in the coming days if any additional questions arise." "I'll be available," said Thomas, handing over his business card. The investigator looked at the card, and his eyes widened. "Blackwell Enterprises?" he asked in surprise. "You're the owner of Blackwell Enterprises?" "Yes, I am," Thomas confirmed modestly. "Sir," said the investigator with renewed respect, "we know your company well. It has an excellent reputation in the region. Thank you, Thomas said simply. I've always tried to do business honestly and respectfully. After the investigators left, taking Michael to the police station, Evelyn approached Thomas and Jason. Well, she said with a smile, I think the evening was more eventful than any of us expected. It certainly was, Thomas agreed, but it was also very revealing. And now, asked Evelyn, are you going back to Rochester tonight? Thomas looked at Jason. What do you think, partner? He asked with a smile. Do you want to see your new property tonight, or would you rather rest and go early tomorrow? Jason thought for a moment. Actually, he said, I'd like to stop by home first to tell my mother what happened. She won't believe it. Great idea, said Thomas. How about if I go with you? I'd very much like to meet the woman who raised a son with such values. Jason's eyes filled with tears again. You would do that? He asked emotionally. Of course I would, said Thomas. After all, we're family now. Evelyn watched that interaction with a warmed heart. She hadn't seen Thomas show such genuine happiness in a long time. Can I arrange a car to take you? She offered. Thank you, Evelyn, said Thomas, but I think we'll take the bus. That's how I came, and that's how I want to go back. Why? Jason asked curiously. Because, Thomas said with a smile, some of life's best conversations happen on simple journeys, and I have a lot to talk about with my new partner. As Thomas and Jason prepared to leave the hotel, Victoria, Samantha and Richard finally got up from the tables where they had been reflecting. I think it's time for us to go, Samantha said with a sigh. Yes, Richard agreed, and I think we have a lot to think about from tonight. Victoria nodded slowly. You know something? She said suddenly. I'm almost glad I lost that deal. Samantha and Richard looked at her in surprise. What do you mean? Asked Samantha. Because if I had managed to buy the land without going through all this, explained Victoria, I would never have learned what I learned today about myself. Richard reflected on those words. You're right, he said slowly. Sometimes we need to lose something important to gain something even more valuable. And what did we gain? Asked Samantha. Perspective, said Victoria simply, and the chance to become better people. The three business people headed toward the exit in silence, each carrying their own reflections about the night that had changed not only their business plans, but their world views. At the reception desk, Thomas and Jason were saying goodbye to Evelyn. Evelyn, said Thomas affectionately, thank you for everything you did tonight, especially for protecting me when things got tense. It was my pleasure, Mr. Thomas, she said sincerely, and congratulations on your choice of partner. I'm sure you'll do great things together. I'm sure too, said Thomas, looking at Jason with pride. Mrs. Evelyn, said Jason, thank you for being kind to me throughout the event. You're a very special person. Thank you, dear, said Evelyn, touched. And remember, whenever you need anything, you can count on me. Thomas and Jason left the hotel together, walking side by side on the sidewalk toward the nearest bus station. Mr. Thomas, said Jason as they walked, can I ask you a question? Of course, son. Why did you choose to test me that way? I mean, if you wanted to find someone with good character, weren't there simpler ways? Thomas smiled sadly. Jason, he said, when you have a lot of money, it's hard to know who likes you for real and who just wants to take advantage. The only way to know people's true character is by seeing how they treat you when they think you can't do anything for them. And it worked, observed Jason. It worked perfectly, agreed Thomas. You treated me well even though you thought I was just a poor farmer. That showed me who you really are. They continued walking in silence for a few minutes, absorbing the events of the night and contemplating the future that awaited them. Mr. Thomas, said Jason eventually, I'm a little afraid. Afraid of what? Afraid I won't live up to the trust you've placed in me, admitted Jason honestly. It's a huge responsibility. Thomas stopped walking and turned to look the young man in the eyes. Jason, he said firmly, you want to know what was the most important quality I saw in you tonight? What? Humility, said Thomas. You didn't pretend to know more than you did. You didn't try to act important. And now you're admitting your fears instead of pretending you don't have any. That humility is what makes me sure you'll succeed." "How can you be so certain?" "Because humble people keep learning and growing," explained Thomas. "Arrogant people think they already know everything and stop evolving. You'll never stop evolving." Thomas's words brought deep comfort to Jason. He felt he had found not just a business partner, but a mentor and a father figure. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything." "Don't thank me yet," said Thomas with a smile. "Wait until you see how much hard work is waiting for you." They laughed together as they reached the bus station. The bus to Rochester was arriving just as they approached the platform. "What perfect timing," commented Jason. "Sometimes," Thomas Blackwell said philosophically, "when you're on the right path, the universe conspires to help." They boarded the bus and found 2 seats side by side. As the vehicle moved away from New York City toward upstate New York, Thomas looked out the window, thinking about all the changes his life had undergone in a single night. He had left home that morning as a lonely man, embittered by the loss of his family and disbelieving in human kindness. He was returning as someone who had rediscovered hope and found a new reason to live. "Mr. Blackwell," Jason said, interrupting his thoughts, "can I tell you something?" "Of course." "When I saw you being humiliated in that hall, I remembered my grandfather," Jason said with emotion in his voice. "He was also a simple man who wore old clothes and spoke with a country accent, but he was the wisest and kindest person I've ever known." Thomas felt a tightness in his chest. "Go on," he asked. "My grandfather always said that a man's true wealth isn't in what he has, but in what he is," Jason continued. "When I saw how you endured all those humiliations with dignity, I thought, this man has the same wealth my grandfather had." "Your grandfather was indeed very wise," Thomas said with a choked voice. "And you are too," Jason said. "That's why I'm sure we'll succeed as partners." The rest of the trip passed with conversations about plans for the property, dreams of sustainable agriculture, and personal stories that helped the 2 men get to know each other better. When they arrived in Rochester, it was past midnight. Jason's small house was in a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by other simple but well-kept homes. "This is it," Jason said when they got off the bus in front of a light blue concrete house. Thomas observed the property with approval. Although small, it was visibly well maintained. There was a small garden in front with colorful flowers, and the house paint seemed recently refreshed. "Your mother takes good care of the house," he observed. "She always said poverty is no excuse for neglect," Jason said with pride. "She taught that to me and my siblings since we were little." They approached the front door and Jason hesitated before knocking. "Are you sure you want to meet my mother tonight?" he asked nervously. "She might get a bit scared by such a late visit." "I'm sure," Thomas said calmly. "And don't worry, I know how to talk to concerned mothers." Jason knocked gently on the door, and after a few seconds they heard footsteps approaching. "Who is it?" came a cautious woman's voice from the other side. "It's me, Mom," Jason said. "Jason. And I brought a visitor." The door opened, revealing a woman of about 60, medium height with graying hair tied in a simple ponytail. Her brown eyes showed a mixture of relief at seeing her son and concern about a stranger's presence at that hour. "Jason," she said affectionately. "What a fright! Why are you so late? And who is this gentleman?" "Mom," Jason said with a smile that lit up his whole face, "this is Mr. Thomas Blackwell, and we have news that will change our lives forever." The woman looked at Thomas with respectful curiosity. "Good evening, ma'am," Thomas said, politely removing his hat. "I apologize for the hour, but your son and I had a very special night, and he wanted to share the good news with you immediately." Come in," she said, opening the door completely. "I won't leave you out on the street at this hour." They entered the small living room, which was simple but cozy. There was an old television, a floral-patterned but well-preserved sofa, and several family photographs on the walls. "Please sit down," Jason's mother said. "I'll make some coffee." "No need to trouble yourself, Mrs. began Thomas. "Margaret," she said with a smile. "Margaret Miller, and it's no trouble at all. Coffee is always ready in this house." Thomas smiled, remembering the simple and genuine hospitality that had characterized his own upbringing in upstate New York. "Mrs. Margaret," he said, Your son is an exceptional young man. Margaret's face lit up with maternal pride. Thank you, Mr. Blackwell, she said. I've always tried to raise my children with good values. I don't have much to offer in material terms, but I try to give love and education. And you've succeeded very well, said Thomas sincerely. Jason demonstrated tonight that he has an impeccable character. Margaret brought 3 cups of coffee and sat down, curious to hear the story that was obviously about to unfold. So, she said, looking between the 2 men, what's this news that has changed our lives? Jason took a deep breath and took his mother's hands. Mom, he said with emotion, Mr. Blackwell has offered me a partnership on his farm. I'll be able to develop my sustainable agriculture projects and gradually become the owner of the land. Margaret looked at her son, then at Thomas, and back at her son, as if she wasn't quite understanding. What do you mean, son? She asked cautiously. Thomas leaned forward, taking responsibility for explaining. Mrs. Margaret, he said gently, I own a 500-acre farm here in the region. Tonight in New York City, I met your son during a business event. He demonstrated exactly the kind of character and values I look for in a partner. But, began Margaret, clearly confused. Let me explain better, said Thomas. I'm 68 years old. I have no family, and I was looking for someone to gradually take over my property, someone who would treat it with respect and develop projects on it that would benefit the community. And you think my Jason? Asked Margaret, still incredulous. I'm certain, said Thomas firmly. Your son showed kindness, courage, humility, and intelligence, exactly what I was looking for. Margaret fell silent for a long moment, absorbing this information. Mr. Blackwell, she said finally, I truly thank you for the trust in my son, but I need to ask a few questions. Of course, said Thomas, ask all the questions you want. How long have you known my son? A few hours, admitted Thomas honestly. And you're going to hand over a priceless property to someone you've known for a few hours? Thomas smiled at the woman's perceptiveness. Mrs. Margaret, he said, you raised a son who defended me when I was being humiliated by rich and powerful people, who risked his own job to do what was right, who demonstrated respect for the land and for life. Some people show their true character in a few minutes, others never do. Margaret looked at Jason with growing emotion. Is it true, son? She asked. You did all that? I only did what you taught me to do, said Jason modestly. Treat all people with respect, no matter who they are. And that's exactly what impressed me, said Thomas. In a world where people are only kind when they have something to gain, your son was kind out of genuine goodness. Margaret felt tears forming in her eyes. Mr. Blackwell, she said with a choked voice, if you're serious about this opportunity, I can guarantee you won't find a more hard-working and honest person than my Jason. I know that, said Thomas, and that's why I'm here. But what about his studies? Asked Margaret worriedly. He's in his final year of college. He'll continue studying, said Thomas. Actually, I want him to finish his undergraduate degree before fully taking over the property. And if he wants to pursue graduate studies, he'll have my support too. Jason looked at Thomas with deep gratitude. You've thought of everything, he said emotionally. Yes, I have, confirmed Thomas. Because when you find the right person, you invest in them completely. Margaret stood up and went to the window, where she remained silent for a few minutes, processing everything she had heard. Mrs. Margaret, said Thomas gently, do you have any specific concerns you'd like to discuss? She turned to him with a serious expression. Yes, I do, she said. I want to understand why a man who clearly has resources and education was in a situation where he needed to be defended by my son. The question demonstrated Margaret's intelligence and insight. Thomas smiled with approval. Excellent question, he said. It shows you're a careful and attentive mother. He spent the next 15 minutes explaining in detail the events of that night, from his arrival at the hotel dressed as a simple farmer to the final revelation of his identity. So you disguised yourself to test people's character? Asked Margaret when he finished. Exactly, confirmed Thomas, and your son was the only person who passed the test with distinction. Margaret sat back down, but this time her expression was one of pride mixed with maternal concern. "Mr. Thomas," she said, "I'm going to be very direct with you." "Please," he said. "My son is a good boy, but he's still young. He has a lot to learn about life and business. Are you sure this responsibility isn't too much for him?" "Mrs. Margaret," said Thomas affectionately, "when I started working with land, I was exactly his age and much less prepared. What made me succeed wasn't knowledge, it was character, and your son already has character." "And if he makes mistakes," insisted Margaret. "He will make mistakes," said Thomas with certainty. "We all do, but the difference is that people with character learn from their mistakes and grow. People without character repeat the same mistakes indefinitely." Jason, who had listened to the entire conversation in silence, finally spoke up. "Mom," he said, "I know it's a big responsibility, and I know I might disappoint, but I also know it's the chance of a lifetime to make a difference in the world." Margaret looked into her son's eyes and saw there the same determination that had led him to work as a waiter to pay for his studies, to study late into the night after exhausting workdays, to never complain about the family's financial difficulties. "All right," she said finally. "If Mr. Thomas believes in you, I believe in you too." Jason stood up and hugged his mother emotionally. "Thank you, Mom," he said. "I promise I'll do everything to deserve this trust." "I know you will," said Margaret, returning the hug. Thomas watched that scene with a warmed heart. It had been a long time since he had witnessed such a genuine display of family love. "Mrs. Margaret," he said when mother and son separated, "you've raised an exceptional son. You must be very proud." "Yes, I am," she said with tears in her eyes, "and now I'm even prouder." "And you?" asked Jason to Thomas. "Don't you have family who might not agree with this decision?" The question touched a still sensitive wound in Thomas's heart. "I don't have any family left," he said sadly. "My wife passed away 8 years ago, and my only daughter 15 years ago. You are the family I've chosen now." The revelation brought a new dimension to the whole situation. Margaret and Jason realized that Thomas wasn't just offering a business opportunity, he was seeking a genuine human connection. "Mr. Blackwell," said Margaret kindly, "if you'd like, you can consider our home your home too. It's not much, but there's always room at the table for one more person." Thomas felt a deep emotion at that simple but sincere offer. "Mrs. Miller," he said with a choked voice, "that would mean a lot to me." "Then it's settled," she said with a smile. "You're going to be our new family member." Jason looked between his mother and his new partner with overflowing happiness. "I can't believe all this is happening," he said. "It feels like a dream." "It's not a dream," said Thomas. "It's the result of you making the right choices in life." They spent another hour talking about concrete plans for the partnership, legal matters that needed to be resolved, and the timeline for the gradual transition of the property. "One last thing," said Thomas as he was preparing to leave. "Tomorrow afternoon, I want both of you to come with me to see the property. Jason needs to see exactly what he's taking on." "Of course," said Jason enthusiastically. "I can't wait." "And Mrs. Miller," continued Thomas, "you're invited too. I want you to see where your son will be working." "It would be an honor," said Margaret. Thomas stood up to leave. "Where are you going to stay tonight?" asked Jason worriedly. "I have an apartment here in the city," said Thomas. "I use it when I need to handle business in the area." "Are you sure?" insisted Margaret. "You can stay here if you want. We have a guest room." "Thank you for your kindness," said Thomas, touched, "but tonight I'd prefer to go to my apartment to process everything that's happened." "I understand," said Margaret. "Then see you tomorrow afternoon." "Until tomorrow," said Thomas. "And thank you for welcoming me so warmly into your home." When Thomas left, Margaret and Jason were alone in the living room, still processing the extraordinary events of the evening. "Son," said Margaret, "are you sure all this is real?" "Yes, Mom," said Jason. "And you know what else? I think Mr. Blackwell needed us as much as we needed him." "What do you mean?" "He lost his entire family," explained Jason. "It must be very lonely. When he chose us as family, he wasn't just giving us an opportunity. He was giving himself a new chance to be happy." Margaret smiled at her son's emotional maturity. "You're right," she said. "And that makes me even prouder of the person you've become." The next morning, Thomas woke up early in his apartment and spent a few hours on the phone resolving legal matters related to the new partnership with Jason. He wanted everything organized before the property visit. Around noon, he stopped by the Miller's house to pick up Margaret and Jason. "Ready to see your new home?" he asked with a smile as they got into his vehicle. "More than ready," said Jason eagerly. The property was about 40 minutes from the city, and during the drive, Thomas explained the history of the place. "I bought this land 30 years ago," he said while driving. "At the time, it was just degraded pasture. I spent years reforesting, creating irrigation systems, building the infrastructure." "You did all that by yourself?" asked Margaret, impressed. "Me, my wife Catherine, and some very dedicated employees," said Thomas with nostalgia. "Catherine had a special gift for handling plants. She planned all the gardens you're going to see." When they arrived at the property gate, Jason was speechless. It was more impressive than he had imagined. The wrought iron gate opened onto a well-maintained dirt road, lined with lush trees. "My God," murmured Margaret, "it's too beautiful." Thomas drove slowly down the road, allowing them to absorb the landscape. There were well-kept green fields, small groves of native trees, and in the distance you could see a large colonial-style house. "That's the main house," explained Thomas. "It has 8 bedrooms, 2 living rooms, a library, an office, and a porch that wraps around the entire building. It was designed for a large family, but now only a lonely old man lives there." Jason noticed the melancholy in Thomas's voice and felt his heart tighten. He was beginning to understand that this partnership meant much more than just a business opportunity for the farmer. "But it won't be lonely anymore," he said kindly. "Now it will have new life." Thomas smiled genuinely for the first time since they started the tour. "I hope so, son. I hope so." They stopped in front of the main house, an imposing yet welcoming structure with its whitewashed walls and red clay roof tiles. The wide porch was adorned with hanging gardens that Catherine had planted years ago, now tended by Thomas with almost religious dedication. "Come in," said Thomas, opening the solid wood door. The interior of the house was even more impressive than the exterior. The furniture was made of solid wood, simple but elegant, and the walls were filled with photographs that told the story of a happy family. Margaret was immediately drawn to a large photo in the main room, showing a younger Thomas next to a beautiful woman with a warm smile and a girl about 10 years old. "Is this your family?" she asked gently. "It was," said Thomas softly. "Catherine and Emily Grace, the 2 women of my life." Jason approached the photo and observed the radiant faces. It was easy to see the love that bound those 3 people together. "They were beautiful," he said sincerely. "Inside and out," Thomas confirmed. "Catherine was a teacher at the town school. Emily Grace wanted to be a veterinarian. She loved taking care of the farm animals." "What happened to them?" Margaret asked carefully. Thomas took a deep breath before answering. It was a story that still hurt to tell even after so many years. "Emily Grace had leukemia when she was 12, he said slowly. "We fought for 3 years, tried every possible treatment, but we couldn't save her. Catherine never fully recovered from the loss. She got sick a few years later, a deep depression that turned into heart problems. The doctors said she died of a broken heart." The silence that followed was respectful and filled with emotion. Margaret felt tears forming in her eyes as she imagined the pain this man had endured. "I'm so sorry," she said sincerely. "It must have been very difficult." "It was," Thomas admitted. "For a long time, I thought about giving up everything, the farm, the business, life itself. But then I realized they wouldn't want to see me destroy everything we built together." "And that's why you decided to find someone to carry on the legacy?" Jason asked with understanding. "Exactly," Thomas confirmed. "This land, this house, all of it was built with love. I couldn't let it die with me." They continued the tour of the house, visiting the library that Catherine had organized with thousands of books, the office where Thomas managed his businesses, and the bedrooms that once housed a happy family. "This was Emily Grace's room," said Thomas, opening a door at the end of the hallway. The room had been preserved exactly as she left it, with veterinary books, animal posters, and a study desk still organized as if she would return at any moment. "You kept everything the same?" Jason asked, moved. "For years, yes," said Thomas. "But now I think it's time to let this space have a new purpose. Maybe an office for you to develop your sustainable agriculture projects." The suggestion deeply moved Jason. Thomas was literally offering the sanctuary of his most precious memories for him to build his future. "Mr. Blackwell," he said with a choked voice, "I promise I will honor your family's memory in everything I do here." "I know you will," Thomas said with conviction. "That's why I chose you." After finishing the tour of the house, they went out to see the property itself. Thomas took them first to the spring he had mentioned the previous night. "This spring provides water for the entire property," he explained, as they walked along a well-kept trail. "It has never run dry, not even in the driest years." When they arrived at the spot, Margaret and Jason were amazed. The spring bubbled up from a natural rock formation, surrounded by lush vegetation that created an almost magical atmosphere. "It's the most beautiful place I've ever seen," Margaret said with admiration. "Catherine loved to come here to read," Thomas said nostalgically. "She said it was where she felt most connected to God." Jason approached the crystal-clear water and touched the surface with reverence. "We could develop a sustainable irrigation system from here," he said, his mind already working on the possibilities. "Responsible water collection, gravity-fed distribution, reuse of return water." Thomas watched the young man's enthusiasm with satisfaction. This was exactly the kind of vision he had hoped to find. "Go on," he said, interested in hearing more. "Well," said Jason, gaining confidence, "I could create different production zones. One area for subsistence organic farming, another for sustainable commercial products, a third for reforestation with native species, and even an area for environmental research and education." "Environmental education?" Margaret asked with interest. "Yes," Jason explained excitedly. "We could host schools, universities, other farmers, teach sustainable techniques, show that it's possible to produce while respecting the environment." Thomas felt a deep emotion hearing those plans. It was exactly the kind of project Emily Grace would have loved to develop if she'd had the chance. "And how long do you think it would take to implement these ideas?" he asked. "Well," Jason said thoughtfully, "starting slowly and growing gradually, maybe 5 years to have everything fully operational, but I could start with smaller projects as early as next semester." "Perfect," said Thomas, "because I have an additional proposal for you." "What is it?" Jason asked curiously. "How about, in addition to the partnership on the property, I fund a pilot project for your environmental education program, something you could use as your thesis project?" Jason looked at Thomas in disbelief. "You would do that?" "Of course I would," Thomas said. "Investing in education is investing in the future, and you have the right ideas to make a difference." Margaret watched this exchange with her heart overflowing with pride. Her son was gaining not just a job opportunity, but a mentor who genuinely believed in his potential. They continued exploring the property, visiting the pasture areas where Thomas raised cattle sustainably, the orchards of native fruits that Catherine had planted, and finally reached the center of the property, where the majestic century-old locust tree Thomas had mentioned the previous night stood tall. "This tree was here when I bought the land," he said, touching the thick trunk affectionately. "Catherine said it was the soul of the property." "It's impressive," Jason said, admiring the immense canopy that provided shade for a considerable area. "It must be over 150 years old." "At least," Thomas confirmed, "and I want it to remain here for another 150 years. "It will continue," Jason promised solemnly. "This tree will be protected as long as I'm here." Thomas smiled at the young man's sincere promise. "Then it's time to make our partnership official," he said, pulling a folder of documents from his backpack. "Already?" asked Jason, surprised. "Already," confirmed Thomas. "I brought the contracts ready. My lawyer prepared everything last night." They sat in the shade of the century-old Jatoba tree to review the documents. Thomas explained each clause carefully, ensuring Jason fully understood the partnership terms. "The property is divided equally between us," he explained. "You take over operational management immediately, and I'll serve as consultant and mentor. As you demonstrate capability and commitment, your share will increase until it reaches 70% in 5 years. And if I can't demonstrate capability?" Jason asked honestly. Then we reassess, said Thomas, but I'm confident that won't happen. Margaret read the documents carefully, using her life experience to identify potential issues. Mr. Blackwell, she said, may I ask a question about the financial matters? Of course. How will property maintenance work? The operational costs, necessary investments? Excellent question, said Thomas, admiring her insight. For the first 2 years, I'll cover all costs. Starting the 3rd year, we begin splitting them proportionally to each one's share, and any profit generated is reinvested in the property until it's completely self-sustaining. And if emergencies arise? Unexpected problems, Margaret insisted. I have sufficient reserves for any eventuality, Thomas assured. Mrs. Margaret, you can rest easy. I won't let your son suffer financially because of this partnership. The guarantee brought visible relief to Margaret. As a mother, her main concern was her son's well-being. Then I agree with everything, she said finally. Jason signed the documents with trembling hands, still hardly believing this was really happening. When he finished, Thomas extended his hand for a formal handshake. Welcome to the family, partner, he said with a warm smile. Thank you for believing in me, said Jason, returning the handshake firmly. Now, said Thomas, how about we get to work? I have some things to show that will interest the future agricultural engineer. They spent the rest of the afternoon exploring more technical aspects of the property. Thomas showed the existing irrigation systems, explained the crop rotation he used, and discussed the specific challenges of the region's soil and climate. One thing that's always worried me, he said as they walked through the fields, is the pressure from businessmen like those we met yesterday. They see land only as a commodity. They don't understand its real value. Do you think they'll try to cause trouble? Jason asked worriedly. Not directly, said Thomas, but the pressure from real estate speculation is constant in the region. Several rural properties have already been sold for subdivisions and commercial developments. And is that bad? It depends, Thomas said philosophically. Development is necessary, but sustainable development. The problem is when entire ecosystems are destroyed in the name of quick profit. Margaret, who had been following the conversation in silence, decided to speak up. That's why it's so important to have people like you taking care of the land, she said, to show there's another way. Exactly, Thomas agreed. And that's why Jason's projects are so important. They'll serve as an example for other landowners. When the sun began to set, they returned to the main house for dinner. Thomas had prepared a simple but hearty meal with products from his own property. Everything here was produced on the farm, he said proudly, serving vegetables, fruits, and grass-fed beef. It's delicious, said Margaret. You can tell it was made with care. Catherine always said the land returns the love it receives, Thomas said nostalgically. When you treat the land well, it feeds you well. After dinner, they sat on the porch to talk and plan the next steps. The evening was pleasant, with mild temperatures and a starry sky. Jason, said Thomas, you'll need a few months to organize your departure from the hotel job and finish your college courses. How about we officially start next January? Perfect, Jason agreed. That gives me time to prepare properly. But you can come on weekends if you'd like, Thomas offered, to start getting familiar with the property's routine. I'd love that, Jason said enthusiastically. Margaret watched the interaction between the two men with satisfaction. She was seeing a genuine friendship forming, based on mutual respect and shared values. Mr. Blackwell, she said, may I say something? Of course, Mrs. Miller. I think this partnership will be good for both of you, she said with maternal wisdom. You'll have someone to share your knowledge with, and my son will have a mentor to guide him. You're right, Thomas agreed. I haven't felt this optimistic about the future in a long time. And I've never felt so confident about my professional future, Jason added. They talked late into the night, sharing personal stories, discussing plans for the property, and building the foundation of a partnership that promised to be much more than a business agreement. When it was time to return to the city, Thomas made one last offer. How about you stay here tonight, he suggested. There are guest rooms ready, and tomorrow we can start early to see other areas of the property. That would be great, Jason said immediately. If it's not a bother, added Margaret. A bother? Thomas laughed. This house has been empty for years. It'll be a pleasure to have company." They settled into the guest rooms, but before sleeping, Jason knocked on Thomas's door. "Sir, can I talk with you for a minute?" "Of course, come in." Jason entered the room and stood still, clearly nervous about something. "What is it, son?" Thomas asked with concern. "I just wanted to thank you again," Jason said emotionally. "Not just for the opportunity, but for how you're treating me and my mother, as if we were real family." Thomas felt a tightness in his chest at the young man's sincerity. "Jason," he said paternally, "you are real family. Family is chosen, not just inherited." "It's just that I never had a father," Jason confessed. "My mother raised me alone, and you're filling a void I didn't even know existed." The word struck Thomas deeply. He, too, was discovering there had been a paternal void in his life that Jason was filling. "Son," he said with a choked voice, "you're also filling a void in my life, a void that's been there since I lost Emily Grace." They embraced, sealing a bond that went far beyond the commercial aspects of their partnership. "Now go to sleep," Thomas said when they separated. "Tomorrow we have a lot of work ahead." "Good night, Thomas," Jason said, using his name for the first time without formality. "Good night, son," Thomas replied, and both felt those words carried special meaning. The next morning they woke up early and spent the entire day exploring every corner of the property. Thomas introduced Jason to the employees who cared for the animals and basic maintenance, explained the production cycles, and began passing on all the knowledge accumulated over decades of farm work. "The most important thing," he said, as they watched the cattle grazing peacefully, "is to understand that every animal, every plant, every piece of land has its specific needs. There's no magic formula that works everywhere." "How did you learn all this?" Jason asked in admiration. "By observing, making mistakes, learning from them and observing more," Thomas said with a smile, "and listening to more experienced people like you're doing now." Margaret, who had preferred to stay in the house organizing some rooms that had been closed for years, joined them for lunch. "How's your day going?" she asked. "Amazing," Jason said enthusiastically. "I'm learning more in a few hours than in months of college." "College gives you the theory," Thomas explained, "but you only learn practice by doing." "And combining the two?" Jason asked. "Then you become a true expert," Thomas confirmed. After lunch, they visited an area of the property that Thomas had kept as an environmental reserve. "This part I never touch," he explained. "It's important to preserve some untouched ecosystems as a reference for what nature does when we don't interfere. And for research too," Jason added. "We can study native species, test how they interact with cultivated areas." "Exactly," Thomas said, impressed once again by the young man's vision. They were walking along the reserve trail when they heard the sound of engines approaching. Thomas stopped to listen carefully. "How strange," he said. "I'm not expecting anyone." When they left the trail, they saw 3 cars parked in front of the main house. One of them Thomas recognized immediately. It was Victoria Hamilton's car. "What is she doing here?" he murmured. "Who?" Jason asked. "Victoria. The executive from last night," Thomas explained. "And from the other cars, it looks like she brought company." They approached the house and found Victoria talking with Margaret on the porch. Beside her were 2 men in suits whom Jason didn't recognize. "Mr. Blackwell," Victoria said when she saw him approaching. "How good that you're here." "Victoria," Thomas said with polite coldness, "what brings you to my property?" "I came to make a proposal," she said with a forced smile. "A proposal that might interest you greatly." "What kind of proposal?" Thomas asked, keeping his distance. Victoria gestured to the 2 men accompanying her. "These are my partners, Brian Wilson and Charles Harrison," she said. "Specialists in large-scale agricultural project development." Thomas noticed she didn't mention Richard Thompson, the drunk businessman from the previous night. Clearly, she had formed a new partnership after the event's fiasco. "Mr. Blackwell," one of the men said, approaching with an outstretched hand, "it's an honor to meet you in person. We know about your reputation in the regional agribusiness." Thomas shook his hand politely, but maintained his cautious expression. "And what exactly do you want?" he asked directly. "Simple," Victoria said, taking control of the conversation again. "We want to make a business partnership proposal, a proposal that could multiply your property's value by 10. "I'm not interested," Thomas said immediately. "But you haven't even heard our proposal yet," Charles Harrison protested. "I don't need to hear it," Thomas said firmly. "I already have a partner." Victoria's eyes turned to Jason with a mixture of disbelief and contempt. "The waiter," she said with poorly disguised disdain. "Mr. Thomas, with all due respect, you're making a terrible mistake." "The only mistake I made," said Thomas, "was not sending you away the moment you arrived." Brian Wilson tried a more diplomatic approach. "Mr. Blackwell," he said softly, "we understand you may have grown fond of the young man, but business is business. Our proposal could generate millions in profit." "And what would this miraculous proposal be?" asked Thomas sarcastically. "Development of an integrated agricultural complex," explained Victoria enthusiastically. "Large-scale cattle farming, soybean monoculture for export, and construction of a distribution center to serve the entire region." Jason felt a knot in his stomach upon hearing that description. It was exactly the opposite of everything he had planned for the property. "In other words," said Thomas slowly, "you want to destroy everything I've spent 30 years building." "Not destroy," protested Charles. "Modernize, optimize, maximize productive potential. By destroying the spring, cutting down native trees, contaminating the soil with pesticides," listed Thomas with growing anger. "They're necessary sacrifices for progress," said Victoria coldly. "For you, perhaps," said Thomas. "For me, they're crimes against nature." Brian Wilson realized the direct approach wasn't working and tried a different strategy. "Mr. Blackwell," he said, "don't you think you're being a bit too sentimental? The young man seems like a good person, but what experience does he have managing a property of this scale?" The question was calculated to provoke insecurity, but had the opposite effect. "He has the most important experience of all," said Thomas firmly. "Character." "Character doesn't pay bills," said Victoria impatiently. "But it pays something far more important," Thomas replied. "It pays for peace of mind." Margaret, who had listened to the entire conversation in silence, decided to speak up. "Excuse me," she said politely, "but I think you should leave." Victoria turned to her with a surprised expression. "Sorry, but who are you?" she asked arrogantly. "I'm the mother of Mr. Blackwell's partner," said Margaret with dignity, "and I can assure you he's not interested in your proposal." "You can't speak for Mr. Blackwell," said Charles sharply. "But I can," interrupted Thomas firmly, "and I'm saying I'm not interested. Now please leave my property." Victoria realized she was completely losing control of the situation. "Mr. Blackwell," she said, almost pleading, "at least give us a chance to better explain our proposal. We have feasibility studies, profit projections, investment guarantees." "I'm not interested," Thomas stated categorically. "But why?" Victoria burst out in frustration. "Why choose an inexperienced young man over established businessmen?" Thomas looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Victoria," he said with forced patience, "last night you publicly humiliated me because you thought I was just a poor farmer. Today you came here because you discovered I have money. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." "But that was yesterday," she protested. "Today is today." "Character doesn't change overnight," said Thomas. "And you've shown exactly who you are." Brian Wilson tried one last card. "Mr. Blackwell," he said, "let's be practical. You're 68 years old. You have no heirs. What will happen to your property when you're no longer here?" The question touched a sensitive point, but Thomas was prepared for it. "It will remain in the hands of someone who loves it as much as I do," he said, looking at Jason with paternal affection. "Someone who will preserve your legacy and your story." "An inexperienced waiter," insisted Charles with disdain. "A young man with values," corrected Thomas, "which is far more than I can say about you." Victoria realized she had definitively lost the battle. "Very well," she said bitterly. "But when this project of yours fails, don't come looking for us." "I won't fail," said Jason, speaking for the first time since the visitors arrived. "Oh, really?" said Victoria sarcastically. And how can you be so sure? Because I have something you don't, said Jason calmly. What would that be? The blessing and support of someone who truly understands this land, said Jason, gesturing toward Thomas, and the determination to honor the trust he has placed in me. Jason's words were spoken with a maturity and conviction that even impressed Victoria. Besides, continued Jason, I'm not alone. I have a family that believes in me and a mentor willing to teach me everything he knows. Thomas felt a wave of pride upon hearing those words. You heard him, he told the visitors. Now, please leave my property before I call security. Victoria, Richard, and Charles realized there was nothing more to be done. They walked toward their cars with expressions of defeat and frustration. You'll regret this, shouted Victoria before getting into the car. The only regret I have, Thomas shouted back, is not realizing last night how pathetic you are. The cars drove off, kicking up dust, leaving Thomas, Jason, and Margaret alone on the porch. Well, said Margaret with a sigh, that was interesting. Sorry about that, said Thomas. I didn't imagine they would be capable of coming all the way here. No need to apologize, said Jason. They should be ashamed. You handled yourself very well, Thomas told Jason. You responded with maturity and dignity. I learned from the best, said Jason with a smile. They went back inside the house, but the unexpected visit had left everyone a bit shaken. Mr. Thomas, said Margaret, could they cause trouble for you? I don't think so, said Thomas. They have no legal grounds to challenge our partnership. It was just frustration. But what if they come back? Asked Jason worriedly. If they come back, we'll deal with them, said Thomas with determination. This property is ours and no one is going to intimidate us. The afternoon passed quietly, but the episode with Victoria and her partners had created a new dimension in the partnership between Thomas and Jason. Now they weren't just partners in a rural enterprise, they were allies against people who represented everything they despised in the business world. You know what? Said Thomas during dinner. I'm actually grateful for their visit. Why? Asked a surprised Margaret. Because it showed me I made the right decision, he explained. Their reaction confirmed that you, Jason, are exactly the kind of person I wanted as a partner. How so? They offered easy money, quick profit, accelerated growth, listed Thomas. Everything most people find irresistible. But you didn't even hesitate to reject them. Because I don't want easy money, said Jason sincerely. I want to build something meaningful, something that makes a difference in the world. Exactly, said Thomas with approval, and that's why our partnership will work. They spent the rest of the evening talking about the challenges they might face, strategies to handle external pressures, and ways to strengthen their partnership. One thing I've learned over the years, said Thomas, is that true success isn't measured only in money. It's measured in positive impact, in legacy left behind, in improved lives. And that's what I want to do here, said Jason. I want this property to be an example of how agriculture can be both productive and sustainable. It will be, said Thomas with conviction. I'm sure of it. The next morning, it was time for Margaret and Jason to return to the city. Jason needed to fulfill his commitments at the hotel and college before dedicating himself fully to the property. When will you be back? Asked Thomas. Next weekend, if you agree, said Jason. Of course I agree, said Thomas. In fact, I want you to come whenever you can. There's a lot to learn. And I'll absorb everything like a sponge, promised Jason. Margaret approached Thomas to say goodbye. Mr. Blackwell, she said emotionally, thank you so much for everything you're doing for my son. Mrs. Miller, he said, I'm the one who should be thanking you. You've brought joy back into my life. You'll always be welcome in our home, she said. Now we're truly family. We certainly are, agreed Thomas, hugging her affectionately. Jason was the last to say goodbye. Thomas, he said, I promise I won't let you down. Son, said Thomas, you've already filled me with pride. Just keep being who you are. They embraced for a long time, sealing a friendship that would last forever. In the months that followed, Jason divided his time between the city and the property. During the week, he worked at the hotel and attended college classes. On weekends, He learned everything about farm management from Thomas. The relationship between them grew and deepened. Thomas found in Jason the son he had lost, and Jason found in Thomas the father he never had. The Sustainable Agriculture Project began to take shape gradually. Jason developed his thesis based on the experiences at the property, receiving praise from professors and classmates. "You've created something truly innovative," said his advisor. "This project could be implemented on farms across the country." "That's exactly our intention," said Jason proudly. When December arrived, Jason graduated as an agronomist with honors. Thomas and Margaret were in the graduation audience, beaming with pride. "Now you're officially qualified to be my partner," said Thomas after the ceremony. "And I'm ready to begin," said Jason with determination. In January of the following year, Jason moved permanently to the property. Thomas had renovated Emily's old room, turning it into a modern office where Jason could develop his projects. "How does it feel working in her room?" asked Thomas on the first day. "As if she's blessing me," said Jason sincerely. "I can feel the positive energy she left here." The Sustainable Agriculture projects were implemented gradually throughout the year. The property became a model of responsible production, attracting visitors from universities, other farmers, and environmental organizations. "You're making history," said an agronomy professor who came to visit the property. "This is the future of American agriculture." The partnership between Thomas and Jason proved even more successful than either of them had imagined. The property prospered not only economically, but also as a center of innovation and environmental education. Margaret also benefited from the new situation. Thomas insisted that she sell her small property and come live on the farm, where she could take care of the main house and help with administration. "This house needs a woman to care for it," he said, "and I need a complete family." "It would be an honor," said an emotional Margaret. 3 years after the meeting at the hotel, the property had been completely transformed. Jason's projects were running perfectly, production was sustainable and profitable, and the environmental education program served hundreds of visitors each month. "You've exceeded all my expectations," Thomas told Jason during a family dinner. "And you gave me a life I never imagined was possible," Jason replied. "You two deserve each other," Margaret said with tears of happiness in her eyes. On a special afternoon, 5 years after his first visit to the property, Thomas called Jason for a private conversation under the ancient locust tree. "Son," he said solemnly, "the time has come to formalize something that's been a reality for a long time." "What do you mean?" Jason asked. Thomas took an envelope from his pocket and handed it to Jason. "The property transfer documents," he said. 70% is yours as we agreed, but I want you to know that in my mind and heart, all this has been yours for a long time." Jason opened the envelope with trembling hands and saw his name as the majority owner of the farm that had become his life and passion. "Thomas," he said with a choked voice, "I don't know how to thank you." "No need to thank me," Thomas said. "Just keep being who you are and keep caring for this land as if it were your daughter." "I will always care for it," Jason promised. "And I will always honor your memory and your family's memory." "I know you will," Thomas said with conviction. That evening, they organized a small but meaningful party to celebrate the formalization of the transfer. Margaret prepared a special dinner, and some of the property's employees joined them. "I'd like to make a toast," Thomas said, raising his glass, "to Jason, who proved that character is worth more than money, that hard work builds more than speculation, and that some of the best families are the ones we choose, not the ones we're born into." "And I want to toast," Jason said, also raising his glass, "to the man who taught me that true success is measured by the good we do in the world, not by the money we accumulate." Everyone toasted under the stars, celebrating not just a successful business, but a family that had formed through shared values and genuine love. Years later, when reporters asked Thomas about his decision to hand over a multi-million-dollar property to a young waiter he had met by chance, he always gave the same answer. "It wasn't by chance. It was because of character. And it was the best decision I ever made in my entire life." The property continued to thrive under Jason's management, who never forgot the lessons he learned about humility, hard work, and respect for the land and people. Interestingly, years later, Victoria Hamilton sought out Jason to apologize for her behavior that night. She had lost a lot of money in speculative investments and learned, the hard way, that character truly matters more than greed. "Thomas was right about me that night," she said. "I had lost my humanity in pursuit of financial success." "It's never too late to rebuild," Jason said generously. "If you want, you can visit our property and see how we do things here." Victoria accepted the invitation and was impressed by what she saw. Thomas, now over 70 but still active and sharp, welcomed her cordially and without resentment. "Did you learn anything from that day?" he asked. "I learned I was on the wrong path," Victoria admitted, "and that people like you are rare and precious." "People like us exist everywhere," Thomas said. "Sometimes they just need an opportunity to emerge." Victoria left the property with a completely new perspective on business and life. 2 years later, she sought out Jason again, this time to ask for help implementing sustainable practices in her own ventures. "You want to help someone who was so cruel to you?" she asked in surprise. "Everyone deserves a second chance," said Jason, "especially when they show they've truly changed." Victoria's transformation became a powerful example of how people can change when they find the right values. Thomas lived to see his property become a national model for sustainable agriculture. When he passed away at 83, in peace surrounded by the family he had chosen, he left behind a legacy that went far beyond land and material goods. He taught us that true wealth lies in the relationships we build and the good we do in the world, said Jason at his funeral, before hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by Thomas. Margaret, who had become a second mother to Thomas in his later years, continued living on the property, taking care of the house and helping Jason with management. "He wanted you to stay here," said Thomas's lawyer when reading the will. "He considered you his true family." The will also revealed one final surprise. Thomas had left substantial resources to create an educational foundation, managed by Jason, aimed at supporting young people from humble backgrounds who wanted to study agronomy and sustainable agriculture. "He wanted to multiply stories like ours," said an emotional Jason while reading the documents. The Thomas Blackwell Foundation became one of the country's leading agricultural education organizations, offering scholarships, mentorship programs, and internship opportunities to hundreds of young people every year. Jason married an environmental engineer he met during a conference on sustainable agriculture. They had 3 children who grew up on the property, learning the same values Thomas had imparted. "Grandpa Thomas used to say, 'The land has a soul,'" Jason would tell his children, repeating Margaret's words about her own grandfather. "And our job is to care for that soul for future generations." The property continues to thrive to this day, not just as a successful business, but as a symbol that it's possible to build wealth without losing values, that character matters more than capital, and that life's best opportunities sometimes come disguised as humiliation. Visitors from around the world come to the property to learn about sustainable agriculture, but they always leave with much deeper lessons about human dignity, mutual respect, and the transformative power of genuine kindness. At the property's entrance, a bronze plaque briefly tells the story of how a humiliated farmer found a courageous young man and how this encounter changed not just their lives, but the lives of thousands of others. In memory of Thomas Blackwell, 1957-2040, who taught us that true wealth lies in character, and that the best investment we can make is to believe in people's kindness. Beneath the plaque, a smaller line. "And in gratitude to Jason Miller, who proved him right." The century-old Jatoba tree is still there, more majestic than ever, protected forever by a family that understands some things are worth more than money: love, respect, dignity, and the courage to do what's right, even when it comes at a high cost. End of story. This story shows us that appearances can be deceiving, and that a person's true value isn't in their clothes or social position, but in their character. Why don't you tell us what you thought of this story of transformation and second chances? Leave your opinion in the comments and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories like this one.